On March 4th, 1883, the entire town of Hollow Creek, Colorado, vanished beneath 30 feet of snow. Every wooden house collapsed beneath the weight. Every chimney was buried before noon. Every soul who had ever laughed at Henrik Vesterly's mole hole was now praying with cracked lips and frostbitten fingers to be saved by the very thing they had mocked. But high on the southern slope of Eagle Ridge, behind a small wooden door, set into the hillside like the entrance to a forgotten kingdom, a boy of 8 years stood beside his mother. His name was Magnus. His small hand was wrapped around the thick fur of an old Norwegian elkhound named Odin. The dog was trembling, not from cold. The cabin carved into the earth was warm as a summer afternoon. The dog was trembling because he could hear what the boy could not. The faint cries far below in the valley of people slowly dying inside their beautiful wooden homes. Magnus looked up at his mother. His voice was barely a whisper. "Mama, are they all going to die?" Ingrid Vesterly did not answer right away. She placed one hand on her son's shoulder and the other on the windowsill carved from cedar. She had been a teacher once in Philadelphia, before her daughter Elise died, before she crossed the country to a place where the wind howled like grieving women. She had been a woman of careful words, and so she chose her words carefully now. "Some will, my love, but not all. Your father is making sure of that." Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the stove crackled softly, and the storm that would become known as the Great White Burial had only just begun. "Before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. I want you to picture yourself in that town in 1883, not as the hero, not as Henrik Vesterly, the strange Norwegian who built his home inside a hill. I want you to picture yourself as one of the townspeople, watching this immigrant family dig their house into the dirt like animals, hearing the laughter at the saloons, the whispered words, the certainty that they had lost their minds. Would you have laughed too, or would you have been one of the few who quietly wondered if they knew something the rest of you had forgotten? Hold on to your answer, because by the end of this story, I want you to ask yourself if it has changed. The Vesterly family came to Hollow Creek in May of 1881, riding in a single horse-drawn wagon pulled by a sturdy brown mare named Sage. They had not come for silver. They had not come for fortune. They had come in the most honest sense to bury something and to build something new in its place. Henrik Vesterly was 41 years old that spring. He was a stonemason by trade, but stone was not just a profession to him. It was a language. He had learned it from his grandfather, Olav Vesterly, in the high valleys of Setesdal, Norway, where the winters did not merely chill the bones. They tested whether a man had built his home wisely or foolishly, where a poorly placed door could mean a frozen wife by morning, where the earth itself was treated not as a thing beneath your feet but as a partner, a mother, a keeper of secrets older than any cathedral. Henrik had immigrated to America in 1862 when he was 22 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades in Philadelphia building churches and townhouses for men with too much money and too little understanding of weather. He had become respected, not wealthy but respected. He had married a young Icelandic-American woman named Ingrid Hjalmarsdóttir, whose grandmother had lived for 64 years inside a turf house in the cold north of Iceland. A house that did not stand upon the earth, a house that was part of it. And then in the autumn of 1879, the Vesterlys lost everything that mattered. Their younger child, a curly-haired little girl named Elise, was 2 years old. She had a laugh like wind chimes. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's quiet patience. One night, the cast-iron stove in the rented wooden house began to smolder behind a wall that had been built too cheaply, too quickly by men who cared more about profit than permanence. By the time Henrik smelled the smoke, the bedroom where Elise slept was already filling with poison air. Henrik tried. God knows he tried. But the house was a coffin built of dry pine and false promises. And when the morning came, Henrik Vesterly held his wife in the ash of what had once been their home, and he made a vow. He spoke it aloud so that God and Ingrid and whatever ghosts were listening might bear witness. "I will never again build a house that kills my children. Never again will wood and arrogance steal what God has given me." Their son Magnus, who was 4 years old at the time, did not fully understand what had happened to his little sister. He understood only that his mother stopped singing for 2 years, and that his father began collecting old books, books written in Norwegian, books written in Icelandic, journals from settlers who had survived blizzards that had killed everyone around them. Henrik read by candlelight night after night for months, and what he read he wrote down in a small leather notebook that he carried in his coat pocket. By the spring of 1881, Henrik Vesterli was ready. He had heard about a place in Colorado where the land was cheap and the cliffs were tall, a place called Hollow Creek, a silver boom town nestled in the Sawatch Range, with sandstone hills on either side, and a wide southern slope that no one wanted because no one could imagine building on a hill instead of a flat. Henrik imagined it perfectly. He sold what little they had in Philadelphia, and he, Ingrid, and young Magnus loaded their wagon and turned their faces west. They brought with them three things that mattered: a trunk full of tools, an old Norwegian elk-hound puppy named Odin, given to them by a Norwegian neighbor, who said the breed could smell a storm 3 days before it came, and Ingrid's grandmother's journal written in elegant Icelandic script, bound in worn brown leather, kept always in a cloth pouch tied around Ingrid's waist. Hollow Creek in 1881 was a town drunk on silver and noise. 3,000 men, 40 saloons, a single school, 2 churches, 1 bank, and money flowing everywhere like water from a busted dam. Land in the valley floor was being bought and sold for sums that would have shocked a Philadelphia bank president. But up on the southern slope where the hill rose at a steep angle and the ground was nothing but red clay and embedded stone, the land was nearly free. Henrik Vesterli walked into the land office on a Tuesday morning in late May. The clerk, a thin man named John Pritchard, looked up from his ledger with mild curiosity. "What can I do for you, mister?" Henrik placed his finger on the map. "This parcel, the southern slope of Eagle Ridge, 17 acres. Pritchard blinked. He looked at the parcel. He looked back at Henrik. "That hill, sir, ain't nothing up there but red clay and rattlesnakes. You fixin' to live like a prairie dog." Henrik did not smile. He counted out $7 and placed them on the desk. "Like a man," he said quietly, "who buried his daughter in a wooden coffin in a wooden house. Never again." The clerk stopped writing for a moment. He had heard a lot of stories from men who came west. But something about the way Henrik said those words made the room feel colder. He took the $7, signed the deed, and watched the strange Norwegian walk back out into the sunlight where his wife and small son waited beside their wagon. That first night, the Vesterli family made camp on the slope of Eagle Ridge. Magnus fell asleep early, curled against the warm flank of Odin, his small face buried in the dog's fur. The fire crackled low. Sage the mare grazed quietly in the meadow below. When she was certain Magnus was sleeping, Ingrid untied the cloth pouch from her waist and removed the worn leather journal of her grandmother Sigrun. She handed it to Henrik by the firelight. "Read this page," she said, "the one I marked." Henrik turned to the page. The Icelandic script was elegant, faded with age. Ingrid translated softly as he looked at the strange letters. "It is from the winter of 1857. My grandmother was 23 years old. A great blizzard struck the north of Iceland. 73 souls perished in the houses with high curved roofs the burst to bear. But every family who lived in a torf bear, the turf houses built into the earth, survived. My grandmother survived because her father had refused to abandon the old ways." She paused. Henrik looked up at her across the firelight. "Henrik, this was not your idea. This was mine. When Elise died, I knew. I knew before you did. I knew we had to go to a place where we could build like my grandmother's father built. I let you believe it was your decision because a man needs to believe he is leading his family. But the truth is, my love, I have been leading us here since the morning we buried our daughter." Henrik was silent for a long moment. He looked at his wife. He looked at the journal in his hands. He looked at the small, sleeping shape of his only living child. Then he reached across the fire and took her hand. "Then we will build it together, my wife, as your grandmother and her father would have wanted." Word travels fast in a town with nothing to do but drink and gossip. By that very evening, every saloon in Hollow Creek was buzzing with the news. A man and his wife and their boy were going to dig their house into a hill. Not build a cabin, not raise a frame, dig like animals. The phrase "the mole hole" was born before sundown in a poker game at the Silver Dollar Saloon, spoken by a man whose name we will come to know very well. His name was Cornelius Ashford Blackwood, and he was the wealthiest man in Hollow Creek. Cornelius Ashford Blackwood was 48 years old, built like a barrel of imported brandy, with a neatly trimmed beard and a pocket watch worth more than most miners earned in a year. He had inherited a mining concern from his uncle and turned it into an empire of 3 working silver mines. He lived in a 3-story Victorian mansion at the head of the valley, a house that had cost him $11,000 to build, a house with imported windows from Denver, hardwood floors from Oregon, and a wraparound porch from which he could survey the town like a feudal lord surveying peasants. His wife, Adelheid Ashford Blackwood, was German-born, the daughter of a Hamburg shipping family. She wore Parisian fashion 6 months out of date and considered herself the queen of Hollow Creek society, such as it was. They had one child, a boy of 10 years named Bartholomew, called Barty by his friends and Bartholomew by his mother when he had misbehaved. Cornelius Ashford Blackwood found the news of the strange Norwegian dirt diggers to be the most delightful entertainment he had encountered in weeks. "The Norwegian's digging his own grave," he announced loudly at the Silver Dollar that night, swirling his brandy. "Saves the undertaker the trouble." The men around him laughed. Cornelius continued, "Give them 1 winter, gentlemen, and they will come crawling down that hill on their knees, begging for a proper roof over their heads. I'll give them an honest job sweeping out the mansion. Lord knows the wife could use a hand." More laughter. The phrase "the mole hole" was repeated and refined and turned into a song by the 3rd round of drinks. By the morning, every shopkeeper in town was using it. By the end of the week, even the children at the schoolhouse were using it. And so began the slow, steady humiliation of a family that had already lost more than the town would ever know. The mockery had many faces, and we should know them all before this story ends. There was Reverend Josiah Pemberton, the fire and brimstone Methodist minister, whose Sunday sermons were attended by half the town. He had heard about the Vesterlies and decided without ever meeting them that they were practicing some form of heathen Norse paganism. "Burying themselves alive like the godless ancients," he preached one Sunday in June. "There is no place in Christian Colorado for the old ways of the heathens. We build our homes in the light of the Lord, not in the darkness beneath the soil." There was Whitcomb Hadfield, a 36-year-old mining engineer with a Yale degree and an opinion about everything. He examined the Vesterli construction site from a distance one afternoon, scribbled some calculations in a notebook, and declared to anyone who would listen that the structure was engineering madness and would collapse within 2 years from groundwater erosion. "I studied this," he said firmly. "Yale taught me what is structurally sound. That hole in the hill is not." There was young Thaddeus Kellerman, called Tad by his friends. 22 years old, a German-American miner with a quick tongue and a quicker temper. He took $50 in bets at the Silver Dollar on whether the Vesterlies would still be living in their hole by Christmas. $2 says they're freezing in their pit before the snow even starts, he told his friends. $5 says the wife runs off east before October. And there was Wilhelmina Crowley, the seamstress, the loudest mouth in town. A woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and a tongue that could flay a saint. She had decided within 3 weeks of the Vesterlies' arrival that Ingrid Vesterli was practicing witchcraft. "Icelandic, you know," she whispered to her customers. "Those northern people, they bring the old gods with them. I have seen her muttering at the wind. I have seen her writing in that book she carries. Mark my words, ladies, there is something not right about that woman." These were the skeptics, 6 in number, each with their reasons, each speaking words that they would in time give anything to take back. But not everyone in Hollow Creek laughed. Old Klaus Brennecke was 71 years old, a German immigrant from Bavaria who had come to America in 1838 and ended up in Colorado almost by accident. He owned a small homestead 2 miles south of town and kept mostly to himself. But when he heard about the Vesterli project, something stirred in his old memory. He hitched up his mule and rode out to Eagle Ridge to see for himself. Henrik was already digging. Magnus, 6 years old at the time, was sitting on a log nearby sketching the shape of the future house in the dirt with a stick. Odin, by then, a full-grown elk hound with a gray-tipped coat and amber eyes, lay watching from the shade of a juniper. Ingrid was setting stones around what would become the threshold. Klaus dismounted slowly. His knees were not what they used to be. He walked up to the construction site, looked at the angle of the slope, looked at the southern exposure, looked at the depth of the excavation. And then he began to laugh. But it was not the laugh of mockery. It was the laugh of a man who has just seen something he had not expected to see again in his lifetime. Erdhuda, he said softly. My God, my grandfather built one of these in Bavaria, survived the great winter of 1830. 42 people died in our village that winter. My grandfather's family did not. Henrik stopped digging. He looked at the old German. The two men did not speak for a long moment. Then Klaus extended his weathered hand, and Henrik took it, and a friendship was sealed in the red clay of Colorado that would change both of their lives and end, as we shall see, in a way that neither of them could have predicted. And then there was Joseph Two Hawks. Joseph Two Hawks was an elder of the Ute people in his 70s who occasionally passed through Hollow Creek to trade hides and dried meat at Thomas Patterson's general store. He was not a mystical figure. He was a practical man. He read the weather the way a Yale-educated engineer reads a blueprint. He knew which clouds meant rain, which winds meant snow, and which animal behaviors meant something far worse was coming. In late September of 1882, Joseph Two Hawks walked into Patterson's store and stood very still for a long moment. Then he spoke in measured English, loud enough for everyone to hear. Big snow is coming. This winter, the wind will bury the living with the dead. The men at the counter laughed. Joseph Two Hawks did not laugh. He simply walked out of the store, mounted his horse, and rode directly to Eagle Ridge. When he arrived at the half-finished Vesterli home, he dismounted and walked to Henrik. He looked at the structure for a long time. He looked at the southern angle at the depth of the earth above the roof, at the cedar beams. And then he bowed his head just slightly, the way one craftsman bows to another. You build like the old ones, he said. Save who you can. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and removed a small necklace strung with bear teeth. He placed it gently around the neck of Magnus, who was now 7 years old. Then Joseph Two Hawks remounted his horse and rode away, and he did not return to Hollow Creek that winter or the next. Henrik watched him go. He said nothing. But that night by lamplight he opened his small leather notebook and added a single line in his careful Norwegian script. Translated, it read, "The old Ute knows, build faster, build deeper, they will come." Are you still with me? Take a breath. Picture that scene. The Norwegian stonemason, the Ute elder, the 7-year-old boy with a necklace of bear teeth around his neck. Two men from worlds that had never been meant to meet, recognizing each other in the language of weather and earth. If you have ever had a grandmother or a grandfather who tried to warn you about something and you didn't listen until it was too late, then you understand what is about to happen in Hollow Creek. Tell me in the comments, who tried to warn you, and did you listen? Now let us continue. Because the Vesterli house was about to be finished, and the winter that Joseph Two Hawks had foreseen was coming faster than anyone in that little Colorado town would believe. The construction of what the town called the mole hole took 14 months. 14 months of patient, brutal labor. Henrik dug into the southern slope of Eagle Ridge 22 feet deep. The main chamber was 20 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 8.5 feet high. The ceiling was supported by massive Douglas fir posts, each 18 inches in diameter, harvested from the high country, and dragged down by Sage the mare, with leather harnesses Henrik had stitched himself. Above the ceiling beams Henrik laid 6 feet of compacted earth. 6 feet. Enough to keep the interior temperature steady at 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of whether it was 95 outside in July or 30 below in January. 3 windows faced south, angled precisely to catch the low winter sun. The glass had been freighted in from Denver and cost more than the rest of the materials combined. But the true genius of the house was not visible to the eye. It was Ingrid's contribution. Drawing on the journal of her grandmother, Sigrun, Ingrid had designed a ventilation system using fired clay pipes buried in the earth around the structure that drew fresh air from outside, warmed it as it traveled through the thermal mass of the hill, and released it gently into the main chamber. The system also expelled stale air through a small chimney disguised as a cairn of stones on the hilltop. This was the technology of the Icelandic turf house, 1,000 years old, kept alive in a leather-bound book by a woman who had never seen Colorado, who had died in Reykjavik long before her granddaughter Ingrid was even born. And then there was the stove. A Norwegian pais, massive and rounded, built of locally quarried stone, with a chimney that wound through the back wall of the house in 3 turns before exiting through the hill. The design held heat for 18 hours after the fire had gone out. It was a kind of magic that needed no magic at all. Just the wisdom of grandfathers written in soot on the inside of every chimney in the cold north. The total cost of the Vesterly home, including the deed, the tools, the windows, and every nail was $312, $11,000 below Cornelius Ashford Blackwood's mansion, and vastly immeasurably more capable of keeping a family alive. Magnus, by now 8 years old, was learning the craft. He mixed mortar, he fetched water, he carried small stones. He listened every evening as his father explained why a certain beam went here and not there, why the south-facing windows were not perfectly vertical but tilted slightly inward, why the door opened outward instead of inward. Each answer was given with the patience of a man who knew that knowledge passed down was the only kind of wealth that outlasted death. Odin was a constant presence on the construction site. He guarded the tools when Henrik went to town. He growled at the strangers who came to mock, and he had a curious habit noted by Ingrid in her own small journal of sitting beside Henrik whenever Henrik paused for water, as if reminding him that the work would continue, but that the man should not forget to rest. In the late summer of 1882, the Vesterly home was complete. Henrik stood at the threshold with Ingrid at his side, and Magnus pressed against his leg, and the three of them looked out from their hilltop at the town of Hollow Creek, below sprawled and noisy and rich with silver. The town that had spent 14 months laughing at them. Henrik spoke softly. "Let them laugh, Ingrid. The stone does not care. The earth does not remember insults." Ingrid took his hand. "No, but I do, Henrik, and when the time comes I will not forget who turned away from us. Not so that we may punish them, so that we may be ready to save them." The first test came that same winter in 1882. It was a mild winter by Colorado standards. Plenty of snow, plenty of cold nights, but nothing extreme, nothing that would truly prove anything. And yet inside the Vesterly home, life was extraordinary in its ordinariness. The temperature held steady at 55 degrees, even on the night when the outside thermometer dropped to 22 below zero. The piece was lit for only 3 hours a day, using a fraction of the firewood that the wooden houses in the valley were burning by the cord. Magnus did his schoolwork at a small cedar table by the south window with sunlight pooling around him. Ingrid baked bread. Odin slept by the stove, his old bones grateful for the warmth. Down in the valley, the town struggled as towns in Colorado always struggled in winter. The Ashford Blackwood mansion proved drafty. 3 stories of imported elegance leaked heat through every window seam. Cornelius hired 2 men just to keep the fires going day and night in the 8 fireplaces that warmed his showpiece home. Adelheid wore furs indoors and complained constantly. But it was a mild winter, and the town concluded predictably that the Vesterlys had simply gotten lucky. "Wait for a real winter," Whitcomb Hadfield said over a glass of port at the Silver Dollar. "Then we will see if their hole holds." It would not be long. That same winter, a young girl named Annalisa Kowalski began to visit the Vesterly home. She was 14 years old, Polish by way of an orphanage in Chicago. She had come to Hollow Creek with her aunt and uncle the previous spring after her parents died of cholera. She was a quiet, watchful girl with a curious mind and a face that rarely smiled. Annalisa had heard the mockery, of course. Everyone in town had. But where the rest of Hollow Creek heard a joke, Annalisa heard a puzzle. Why would a man so respected as a builder choose to dig his house into a hill? There had to be a reason. And so one cold Sunday afternoon in February of 1883, Annalise walked the steep trail up to Eagle Ridge by herself, with no announcement, no introduction, just an honest desire to know. Henrik was splitting kindling when she arrived. Odin barked once and then, sensing no threat, returned to his nap. Henrik straightened, wiped his brow, and looked at the girl. "You are far from home, miss." "I want to learn," she said simply. "Will you teach me?" Henrik looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and gestured for her to come inside. Ingrid greeted her warmly. Magnus, who was usually shy with strangers, took her hand and showed her his room, which was a small alcove with its own south-facing window and a wooden bed his father had built. Annalise ran her fingers along the cedar beams. She looked at the clay ventilation pipes. She listened for 2 hours as Henrik explained the principles of thermal mass, of passive solar warming, of the wisdom of Norwegian builders dead 2 centuries before her birth. When she left at sunset, she paused at the threshold and turned back. "Mr. Vesterli, may I come again?" "Every Sunday," Henrik said. "If you wish." And so Anneliese Kowalski became, without anyone in town knowing it, the first student of the old ways. The first to carry the knowledge into the future. The first to inherit what Henrik's grandfather had passed down 1,000 miles, and 40 years ago in a Norwegian valley most Americans could not even pronounce. She would in time save Henrik Vesterli's life. But that is a story for later in this story. I want you to pause here for a moment before the storm arrives, because I want you to think about your own life. Is there a young person in it? A grandchild, a niece, a neighbor's daughter? Someone who has been quietly watching you, learning from you, asking the kind of questions that adults are too tired to ask anymore. Whatever you have to teach them, do not wait. Teach them now. Teach them this winter, because the world has a way of testing us when we least expect it. And the things we know, the wisdom we carry in our bones, is only valuable if we pass it on while there is still time. Tell me about that young person in the comments. I want to know. The summer of 1882 had been strange. Everyone in Hollow Creek said so, though no one took it seriously. The deer came down from the high country in August, 6 weeks earlier than usual. The squirrels gathered nuts with a kind of frantic urgency that old-timers had not seen in 20 years. The woolly caterpillars were solid black from end to end with no orange band at all. The geese flew south in early September, and there were more of them than anyone could remember. Henrik noticed. He stocked the storage room of the earthen home with 400 pounds of smoked elk meat, 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of dried beans, 60 pounds of coffee, and enough salt and dried herbs to last a small army for 8 months. He added a second storage chamber dug deeper into the hill behind the main house. And then one night in October, he began doing something he did not tell Ingrid about. He began digging a secret tunnel. It led from the back of their bedroom alcove, sloping gently upward for nearly 40 feet before emerging at a small hidden opening behind a thicket of juniper near the natural hot spring that bubbled out of the hillside year-round. It was a second exit, an escape route in case the main entrance should ever be blocked by snow or debris. Henrik dug at night after Ingrid and Magnus had gone to sleep. He told himself he was being practical, cautious, prudent, but the truth was deeper. The truth was that Henrik Vesterli had been planning for a disaster ever since the night Elise died. The truth was that he had read the journals of survivors. He had calculated the cycle of great blizzards the way some men calculate the cycle of stars. He knew that every 25 or 30 years the high Rockies were hit by a winter that killed. He knew that the last one had been in 1856 in Minnesota. He knew the math. He knew what was coming. Ingrid caught him one night in November. She woke to find his side of the bed empty, and she rose with a candle and followed the faint sound of digging to the back of their bedroom. There by lamplight was her husband, covered in red Colorado dust, his hands raw, his eyes hollow with fatigue. She did not speak for a long time. She just watched him. Finally, she said, "How long have you known Henrik?" He stopped digging. He turned to her. His face was the face of a man who had been carrying a heavy stone for years and was only now setting it down. "Since Elise, since I read the journals. I knew it would come, Ingrid. I did not know when, but I knew it would come." She set down the candle. She walked to him, and she put her arms around her husband in the red dust in the lamplight, and she wept for the first time in many years. Not in sorrow, in relief. "Then we will save more of them than we thought," she whispered. "Not less, more." The storm came on the first day of March, 1883. It began like any other late winter storm. A gray morning, a light, steady snowfall by 10 o'clock, a rising wind by noon. By evening, 8 inches had fallen, which was not unusual for the Sawatch Range in March. The town went to bed without concern. By the morning of March 2nd, 18 inches lay on the ground. The wind had risen to 40 miles an hour. The schoolhouse was closed. The saloons were full. Cornelius Ashford Blackwood ordered his servants to bring in extra firewood. By the evening of March 3rd, 36 inches had fallen. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees below zero. The wind chill by modern measure was 52 degrees below. Tad Kellerman, walking the half-mile from the Silver Dollar to his rented room, lost feeling in 2 fingers along the way. He did not know yet that he would lose those fingers entirely. By the morning of March 4th, the lower floors of the wooden houses had begun to disappear behind drifting snow. The thermometer outside Patterson's general store read -33. The snow was still falling faster now, blown sideways by winds that screamed through the valley like the voices of every angry god and every forgotten religion on earth. And up on Eagle Ridge, behind the small cedar door of the earthen home, Henrik Vesterly sat at his table and read by lamplight, while his wife knitted and his son did sums on a slate. The temperature in the house was 56 degrees. Odin slept by the pays. Outside, the world was ending. The first death came on the fourth day of the storm, and it was the death that hurt Henrik the most. Old Klaus Brennecke, the German immigrant who had recognized the earthen home for what it was, who had become Henrik's quiet ally and dear friend, was missing. He had gone out in the worst of the wind to check on his small herd of cattle. His wife Edda sent word by way of a desperate young man who staggered up the hill to the Vesterly home on the evening of March 4th, half blind from the blowing snow. Henrik went out into the storm to look for Klaus. He took Odin with him. He searched for 2 hours in winds that knocked him to his knees in a darkness that swallowed even the lantern light. He did not find Klaus that night. He found him the next morning, 30 feet from his own cabin door. The old German had become disoriented in the whiteout. He had walked in circles perhaps for an hour, perhaps for 2, until the cold took him. His eyes were closed. His hand was outstretched, reaching toward the cabin he could not see. He looked in the end as if he had simply lain down to rest. Henrik carried Klaus back to his cabin on his shoulders. He helped Edda prepare the old man for burial, which would have to wait until the spring thaw. He held Edda's hand. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. Then he walked back to the Vesterly home, exhausted and grieving, and he sat down on his bed and he put his face in his hands. Magnus came to sit beside him. The boy looked very small and very serious. "Daddy." Mr. Klaus said he understood the cold. He told me his grandfather knew the old ways too. Why did the cold take him? Henrik gathered his son into his arms. He spoke slowly. Mr. Klaus did understand, son. He understood better than almost anyone in this town. But understanding is not enough. You also need the right shelter. Mr. Klaus's house was made of wood. And wood in a storm like this cannot save you no matter how much you know. Magnus thought about this for a long time. Then he reached up and touched the necklace of bare teeth that hung around his neck. The gift from Joseph Two Hawks. "Daddy, can I put this on Mr. Klaus's grave when the snow melts?" Henrik kissed his son's forehead. "Yes, my boy, you can." The storm went on, 5 days, 6, 7. By the 8th day of the storm, the snow had reached the second-floor windows of most of the wooden houses in Hollow Creek. Chimneys were blocked, stoves were dying, families were burning their furniture to stay warm. Reverend Pemberton's church had partial roof collapse on the night of March 8th, and the Reverend himself was injured, his right leg pinned briefly under a falling beam. He was rescued by his deacons, but he was bedridden and his pulpit was silent. The Patterson family of 4 was trapped on the second floor of their store, the first floor having been crushed by accumulating snow. Mrs. Patterson, who had a weak heart, began to fail. The Kellerman boarding house, where Tad lived with 6 other miners, was sealed shut by drifting snow. The men inside were forced to break a hole in the roof for air, which let in the storm which froze them as surely as the lack of air would have. The Ashford Blackwood mansion suffered structural damage on the night of March 9th. The north wall began to crack under the weight of the snowdrift against it. Cornelius and Adelheid retreated to the kitchen, the most central room of the house. They huddled there with Bartholomew and 3 of their servants. The temperature in Hollow Creek on the morning of March 10th was 41 degrees below zero. The wind was still blowing. And on the slope of Eagle Ridge inside the earthen home, Magnus stood at the south-facing window with Odin pressed against his leg, and he watched the dark smoke trails rising from the chimneys he could still see. Some of those trails were thin and pale, the way smoke should look when a fire is burning clean, but others were dark, black, choking, the kind of smoke that meant a chimney was blocked and a stove was suffocating and people inside were burning their lives away one breath at a time. Magnus turned to his mother. "Mama, the Pattersons' chimney is dark, and the boarding house, and I cannot see the Ashford Blackwoods anymore." Ingrid looked. She placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "I see, my love. Your father will go soon as it is safe." Magnus looked up at her. His face was somber beyond his years. "What if it is never safe, Mama?" Ingrid did not answer. She just held her son. On the 11th day of the storm, disaster came even to the earthen home. A small avalanche of snow slid down the upper slope of Eagle Ridge in the early morning hours of March 11th, and it buried the entrance to Henrik's secret tunnel. The hidden second exit behind the juniper thicket was sealed. At the same time, the main ventilation pipes, which drew fresh air down through the hilltop, began to clog with packed snow. Henrik noticed first. He felt the air growing thick. He saw the candle flames begin to flicker and dim. He felt the slight pressure in his chest that meant his lungs were not getting what they needed. Magnus felt it next. The boy grew dizzy. He stumbled when he rose from the table. Ingrid caught him and laid him gently on the bed, and then turned to Henrik with eyes that did not need words to speak. Henrik began to dig. He dug at the ventilation shaft from the inside, using a long iron rod he had made for exactly this purpose. He worked for 6 hours alone in air that was growing dangerously thin. Ingrid sat with Magnus, talking to him to keep him awake, reading from her grandmother's journal in soft Icelandic, the language of her childhood. Odin would not leave the boy's side. By midnight on the 11th day, the candles were nearly out. Henrik's hands were bleeding through his gloves. The air was so thin that he could feel his vision starting to gray at the edges. And then there came a knock at the door. Henrik froze. Ingrid looked up. Even Odin lifted his head. It was impossible. No one could be out in the storm. No one could have climbed Eagle Ridge in this weather. No one. Henrik dragged himself to the door, his lungs burning, and he pulled it open. Standing in the snow, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, holding a clay pipe nearly 5 feet long, was Annalise Kowalski, the 14-year-old girl, the student, the orphan from Chicago who had spent every Sunday afternoon since February listening to Henrik Vesterly explain the principles of passive ventilation and thermal mass. She had built her own miniature earthen shelter, half the size of the Vesterly home, behind her aunt and uncle's cabin in the autumn of '82. She had done it secretly with materials she could find or trade for. Her uncle had thought it was a foolish project for a girl, but he had let her do it. When the storm came, Annalise had survived in her small dugout while the cabin above failed. She had been alone in her little shelter for 9 days. And on the 11th day, when she sensed that something might be wrong at the Vesterly home, she had taken her spare clay ventilation pipe, the one Henrik had given her as a gift back in February, and she had set out to climb Eagle Ridge in the worst blizzard in Colorado history. She looked at Henrik. Her face was raw from the wind. Her eyes were steady. "You taught me, Mr. Vesterly. Now I teach back." She handed him the pipe. Together they worked for 3 more hours in the cold and the dark to clear the main ventilation system and install the spare pipe as a backup. By dawn on the 12th day, the air inside the earthen home was clean again. Magnus was sleeping safely. Ingrid was weeping quietly with Annalise in her arms. And Henrik Vesterly stood at the threshold of his own house and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had become not only a man who built shelters, he had become a man who built builders, who passed on what could not be lost again. The storm broke on the morning of March 13th, 1883. The wind died first. Then the snow stopped falling. Then slowly the sun rose over a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. White, silent, frozen, cratered with the buried shapes of houses and barns, and entire blocks of a town that had simply ceased to exist above the level of the snow. Henrik did not waste a moment. He prepared the rescue equipment he had stockpiled for months: ropes, shovels, lanterns, hot broth in sealed iron pots, wool blankets. He woke Ingrid. He woke Annalisa, who had slept on a cot by the stove. He kissed Magnus on the forehead and told him to stay with Odin and to mind his mother. Magnus looked up at his father with the serious eyes of a boy who had aged years in 12 days. "Daddy, I want to come." "No, son, you stay here. You are the keeper of the house. If anyone arrives before we return, you let them in. You feed them. You keep them warm. That is your job. Can you do that?" Magnus nodded. Henrik, Ingrid, and Annalise roped themselves together and descended into the buried town of Hollow Creek. The Patterson family was the first they reached. Henrik found the smoke trail of their stove still rising weakly, and he and Ingrid dug for 5 hours straight to break through the snow and reached the second-floor window of the general store. They lowered ropes. They pulled out Mr. Patterson first. Then Bobby Patterson, age 9, who had been Magnus's classmate. Then little Susan Patterson, age 6, who was barely conscious. Mrs. Patterson did not come out alive. Her weak heart had stopped 2 days before. Mr. Patterson clung to Henrik when he was pulled from the snow and wept the wordless tears of a man who has lost the one person he could not survive losing. They brought the Pattersons up to the earthen home. Magnus opened the door. He had prepared warm blankets as his mother had taught him. He had broth ready on the stove. He helped little Susan drink. He let Bobby Patterson hold Odin because Bobby was crying and the dog seemed to understand. Henrik returned to the snow. He found Reverend Pemberton next. The minister was alive but unable to walk. Henrik carried him out on his back, the broken-legged preacher draped over his shoulders like a sack of grain. When they reached the earthen home, Pemberton refused to enter at first. He was weeping. "I preached against you, Vesterli. I called your ways heathen. I told my flock you were practicing pagan rites, and you have come to save my life." Henrik looked at him steadily. "Reverend, the earth does not know what you preached. Come inside." Pemberton crossed the threshold and he sank to his knees on the cedar floor, and he prayed. The prayer was for forgiveness. Tad Kellerman was rescued from the boarding house on the 3rd day after the storm. He had survived. 3 of the 6 men with him had not. Tad had lost 3 fingers on his right hand to frostbite. When Henrik pulled him from the snow, Tad looked at the Norwegian he had bet against in 1881, and he tried to speak, but his cracked lips could not form the words. Later in the warmth of the earthen home, Tad managed to take the $50 from his jacket pocket, the winnings of his cruel bets from the previous year, and he placed them in Henrik's palm. "You won, sir. You won everything." Henrik gave the money to Annalise to fund her own work. Tad nodded as if he understood, and he wept. And he ate the broth Magnus brought him, and he never made a bet against another man for the rest of his life. Wilhelmina Crowley, the seamstress, whose tongue had spread the witch rumors about Ingrid for 2 years, was found on the 5th day. She had survived in her small shop because 3 of her wooden walls had been protected by a deep snowdrift, not because anything she had built was sound. When Henrik dug her out, she could not look him in the eye. She was brought up to the earthen home with the others, and for 2 days she sat in a corner by the stove, silent, her hands shaking. On the 3rd day, she rose and walked to where Ingrid was nursing little Susan Patterson back to strength. She carried with her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a hand-stitched quilt, blue and white, very fine work. She had been making it over the winter for her granddaughter in Denver. She placed it in Ingrid's hands without a word, and she wept, and she walked back to her corner. She never spoke another unkind word about any soul in Hollow Creek for the rest of her life. By the morning of the 5th day after the storm, 47 souls were sheltering inside the earthen home that had been built for 3. Ingrid organized them like a school. She divided the chambers into sections. She rationed the food. She tended to the wounded with Annalise at her side. Magnus carried water, fed the dog, and spoke quietly to Bobby Patterson, who had not stopped trembling. But there was one family left, the Ashford Blackwoods. Henrik dug to the Ashford Blackwood mansion on the 5th day after the storm. The structure was unrecognizable. The collapsed walls were buried under 20 feet of snow. Henrik dug down to what had once been the kitchen, the central room where the family had retreated. He pulled out Cornelius first. The man was barely conscious. His face was blackened with frostbite. His hands were ruined. He would lose 3 fingers in the weeks to come. He pulled out Adelheid next. Her leg was broken, snapped clean below the knee by a falling roof beam. She was alive but in shock. And then he came to Bartholomew, Barty Ashford Blackwood, 10 years old. The boy who had pushed Magnus into the mud. The boy whose cruelty in the schoolyard had been a smaller version of his father's cruelty in the saloons. Barty had been trapped on the 2nd floor when the roof gave way. He had been struck by a falling beam. He had died, the coroner would later determine, on the 2nd day of the storm. He had died without pain. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. Henrik knelt in the snow beside the small body. He worked carefully with great gentleness to free the boy from the wreckage. When Cornelius understood when he saw his son's body lifted into the daylight, he made a sound that was not human. It was the sound of a man whose world has ended. Adelheid screamed her son's name, over and over, Henrik did not speak. He did not move for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and removed the necklace of bare teeth that Magnus had given him to bring along. He placed the necklace gently on Bartholomew's chest. "For safe passage, little one. The old ones will know you." Cornelius Ashford Blackwood, the wealthiest man in Hollow Creek, the man who had called the Vesterless fools and the wife a witch, looked up at Henrik through frostbitten eyes streaming with tears. "I called you a fool. I called your wife a witch. I let my son grow up hating yours. And now my son is dead and yours is alive. The earth chose Vesterly, not God, not money. The earth chose." He could not speak after that. Henrik helped him to his feet, and Adelheid was placed on a sledge, and they made the long, slow journey up to the earthen home together. 3 living, 1 dead. A family that had ruled Hollow Creek had been broken into pieces, and the man who carried them home had been mocked by them for 2 years. I need you to pause again here, because what I am about to tell you is the moment that this story has been building toward. It is not the rescue. It is not the deaths. It is not even Cornelius's confession. It is what Magnus did when Bartholomew's body was carried into the earthen home. The boy looked at the body of his bully, the boy who had pushed him into the mud, the boy whose cruel words had made him cry. He looked at Bartholomew, who had died while he, Magnus, was alive. And then Magnus walked to his own bed, to the small alcove where he slept, and he took down his warmest wool blanket, the one his mother had knitted for him in Philadelphia before they came west, the one with the blue stars stitched along the border, his favorite thing in the world. He walked to where Adelheid sat weeping over her dead son. He held out the blanket. "For Barty, ma'am, so he won't be cold." Adelheid Ashford Blackwood looked up at the small boy, the wife of the man who had ruined her family with his pride. She took the blanket from Magnus's small hands, and she pressed her forehead against the boy's, and they wept together. And the woman who had refused to be friends with Ingrid Vesterly for 2 years suddenly understood every wrong she had ever done. Whitcomb Hadfield arrived at the earthen home on the 6th day after the storm. The Yale-educated engineer had survived inside his rented rooms above the assay office, which had not collapsed but had nearly killed him through cold. He had walked half-frozen 2 miles through the snow to reach Eagle Ridge. He stood at the threshold. He looked at the structure he had once called engineering madness. He looked at the 50 people inside, a live, warm-fed safe. He looked at Henrik Vesterly, who was so exhausted he could barely stand. Whitcomb Hadfield reached into his coat. He pulled out the engineering notebook he had carried for years, the notebook in which he had secretly recorded his measurements of the Vesterly home back in the autumn of '82. The measurements that had proven in his own private calculations that everything he had been taught at Yale about cold climate construction was incomplete, and that this strange Norwegian had rediscovered principles that the universities had forgotten. He had kept the notebook hidden. He had been a coward. He had not wanted to lose his reputation. He had let the town go on mocking the man whose work he had secretly admired. He held out the notebook to Henrik. "Mr. Vesterly, I have been a coward. I knew. I have known for months. I measured your house. I calculated its efficiency, and I said nothing. I let them go on calling you a fool because I was afraid that if I told the truth, I would lose my standing. 3 of my neighbors are dead, sir. They might be alive if I had spoken." He paused. His hands were shaking. "From today, I will document everything you know. I will publish it. I will teach it. I will make sure the world learns what your grandfather taught you. It is the only way I can begin to repay the debt I owe." Henrik took the notebook. He looked at Whitcomb Hadfield for a long time. "Then we will work together, sir. There is much to do." The full death toll of the Great White Burial of 1883 was 23 souls. Among them, sweet little Bartholomew Ashford Blackwood, age 10. Mrs. Patterson, who had a weak heart. 3 miners from Tad Kellerman's boarding house. Old Klaus Brennicke, who had understood the cold but had built in wood. And 17 others scattered across the buried town. 69 souls survived. 47 of them were saved inside the Vesterly home in the days after the storm. Another 22 were rescued in the weeks that followed, dug out of their buried homes by the rescue teams that Henrik organized and led personally. It was a tragedy. It was also, by every measure, an act of grace, Because without the strange Norwegian stonemason and his wife and their son and the orphan girl who climbed a hill in a blizzard, and the dog who had warned them all the death toll would have been every soul in Hollow Creek. The reckoning came in late April when the snow had melted enough for the survivors to gather. They met at the base of Eagle Ridge in the shadow of the earthen home that had saved them all. There were no buildings left standing in the valley, no church, no saloon, no assay office, no mansion. Hollow Creek as a town was gone. Cornelius Ashford Blackwood was the first to speak. He had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. His face was still healing. His son was buried in the small cemetery on the hilltop where Klaus Brennicke also rested, and Mrs. Patterson and the others. He stood before the survivors of the town he had once ruled, and he was not the man he had been. "I spent my life building monuments to my own vanity," he said, his voice rough. "Grand houses, impressive facades, things meant to be admired by men I did not respect. The Vesterlists built something different. They built something that worked with the land instead of against it. They built something that lasted. My son did not last. My house did not last. My pride did not last. Only their hill remains." He turned to Henrik and Ingrid, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. "I mocked you. I called you fools. I called your wife a witch. I let my own son grow into a boy who pushed yours into the mud. I have nothing left to offer but my apology and the rest of my life and what is left of my money. They are all yours if you want them." Ingrid stepped forward. Her voice was clear. "Mr. Ashford Blackwood, you owe us no apology that we have the power to accept. The past cannot be unwritten, but the future can be built differently. We are all alive. That is what matters now." She looked around at the faces of her neighbors. People who had laughed at her. People who had refused her friendship. People she and her husband had pulled from the snow with their own hands. "Hollow Creek will be rebuilt," she said, "but we will not rebuild as before. We will not build quickly. We will not build cheaply. We will build with the earth, not upon it. We will build homes that will shelter our grandchildren and their grandchildren and theirs after them. My husband will teach anyone who wishes to learn. I will help. Our son will help. And Miss Annalisa Kowalski, who saved my husband's life and my son's life when I could not, will lead the next generation of builders in this valley." Henrik stepped beside his wife. He spoke for the first time that day. "The stone is patient. It will wait for us to understand." The rebuilding of Hollow Creek took 3 years. The town that rose was nothing like the one that had been buried. Every new home was built into the southern slopes of the surrounding hills. Some were full earthen dwellings like the Vesterly home. Others used the hillside as a back wall with overhanging eaves of thick sod above. Every home faced south. Every home used thermal mass. Every home had ventilation systems based on Ingrid's grandmother's design from Iceland. Cornelius Ashford Blackwood never rebuilt his mansion. He used the last of his fortune to fund the construction of the Vesterly Community Hall, a great earthen building carved into the eastern hillside designed to shelter every soul in town if disaster ever came again. He worked on the project himself, his ruined hands learning to lay stone alongside Henrik's. He found in that hard work a satisfaction his wealth had never given him. He died in 1897 of pneumonia. He was buried beside his son Bartholomew. Adelheid lived another 15 years, and she taught Polish needlework to Annalise Kowalski, and the 2 women became close friends. Whitcomb Hadfield kept his promise. In 1885, he published a small book through a Boston press. It was called Earth-Sheltered Construction, a Norwegian-American Tradition. It was the first technical treatise on passive solar design ever published in the United States. He credited Henrik Vesterly on every page. He spent the rest of his career teaching the techniques at small colleges across the country. He died in 1906, beloved by his students, free at last of the burden of having once been a coward. Annalise Kowalski grew into the finest builder of earthen homes in the American West. By the turn of the century, when she was 31 years old, she had personally designed and helped construct over 140 earth-sheltered dwellings throughout the Sawatch Range. She married a young carpenter from Pueblo in 1893. She had 4 children, and she taught them all the old ways, and they taught their children, and the knowledge did not die. Henrik and Ingrid Vesterly lived in their earthen home for the rest of their lives. They became, in the words of the local newspaper at the time, the patriarch and matriarch of Hollow Creek. Henrik traveled occasionally to lecture at universities in Denver and Salt Lake City, where engineers had begun to take a serious interest in his work. Ingrid taught at the small school that was built into the eastern hillside, and her students were the children of the families they had once saved from the snow. Old Odin, the Norwegian elk hound who had warned the family of the coming storm, lived to be 16 years old. He died peacefully in front of the peace stove on a winter evening in 1894, with Magnus at his side. The boy, now 19 years old, buried him on the hilltop where the sun would warm the grave each morning. He placed a small stone there into which his father carved a simple line. Odin Vesterly, 1878 to 1894. He smelled the storm before we did. Sage, the brown mare who had pulled every cedar beam and every stone of the Vesterly home up the steep trail of Eagle Ridge in the summer of 1881, lived to be 27 years old. She died in the spring of 1898 in the small stable Henrik had built into the hillside beside the main house. Magnus, by then 23, buried her in the lower meadow where the wildflowers came up first each spring. She had carried in her steady, patient way every brick of their salvation. Joseph Two Hawks, the Ute elder, who had foreseen the storm and given Magnus the necklace of bear teeth, was never seen in Hollow Creek again after that autumn day in 1882. Magnus, as a young man, made inquiries among the Ute communities to the south. He learned that Joseph had died peacefully among his people in the winter of 1885, 3 years after the storm. His final words, according to those who were with him, were these: "I gave the bare teeth to the Norwegian boy. He will pass them on. The old ways are safe." Magnus Vesterly grew into a quiet, serious young man. He studied engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, though he often said his father had taught him more than any professor. He returned to Hollow Creek. In the autumn of 1899, he married a young woman named Halka Brennicke, the great niece of old Klaus, who had come to Hollow Creek from Bavaria after her own parents died and had been raised by the Brennicke family. Henrik often said that Klaus was watching over them all on their wedding day. Magnus and Halka had 3 children. The eldest, a boy, was named Klaus, after the old German who had died 30 feet from his cabin door. The second, a girl, was named Elise, after the sister Magnus had lost when he was 4 years old. The third, another boy, was named Olav, after Henrik's grandfather in Norway, the man who had started it all. Henrik Vesterly died in the winter of 1915 at the age of 75. He died in the bed he had carved from cedar by his own hands, in the house he had dug from the earth with his own hands, with his wife at his side and his son holding his hand. His last words were in Norwegian. They translated simply to, "The earth was kind." Ingrid Vesterly followed him in the spring of 1916. She was buried beside her husband on the hilltop near the grave of Odin, and the grave of Klaus Brennicke, and the grave of Sage in the lower meadow below. Magnus Vesterly became mayor of Hollow Creek in 1917. He served for 20 years. He died in 1962 at the age of 87 in the same house where he had grown up. The earthen home had stood by then for 80 years. It had outlived everyone who had ever mocked it. In 1978, a team of researchers from Colorado State University drove a Land Rover up the steep dirt road to Eagle Ridge to study the Vesterly home, which had been donated to the state by Magnus's grandchildren. The researchers spent 3 months at the site. They installed temperature sensors. They measured the thermal mass of the earth walls. They calculated the energy efficiency of the structure. What they found stunned them. The interior temperature of the earthen home held steady at 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of whether the outside temperature was -30 in January or 95 in July. The structure required 2.7 times less energy to heat than a conventional wood frame home of comparable size. The ventilation system, built of fired clay pipes installed in 1882, was still functioning perfectly. The principles of passive solar design and thermal mass that Henrik Vesterly had carried in his head, learned from his grandfather Olaf in a Norwegian valley, were identical to the smallest detail to the principles of modern passive house architecture that European engineers would not begin to formalize until 1990. In 1985, the Vesterly home was designated a National Historic Landmark. The plaque set into the stone beside the cedar door reads in part, "Here lived Henrik and Ingrid Vesterly, immigrants from Norway and Iceland, who carried the wisdom of their grandparents across an ocean and a continent and used it to save 69 lives during the Great Blizzard of 1883. Their home, dismissed as foolish by their neighbors, proved to be one of the most efficient and resilient dwellings of the American frontier era. The earth held them. They knew it would. Above the cedar door carved by Henrik's own careful hand in 1910 are three words in Norwegian. They have weathered more than a century of mountain storms, but they have never been erased. Jordan Holder Os, the earth holds us. When visitors ask the guides why the inscription is in Norwegian and why Henrik did not carve it in English, the guides always tell them the same story. Ingrid Vesterli wrote her last letter to Magnus from her sickbed in the spring of 1916, just before she died. In that letter, she explained the meaning of those words. My darling boy, when your father carved those words above our door, he asked me which language to use. I told him to write them in Norwegian because his grandfather Olav taught him those words in Norwegian, in a valley far across the sea, in a language that has known the cold for 1,000 years longer than English has. Those words are not a sentence. They are a prayer. They are a promise. They are the inheritance that your great-great-grandparents left for us and that we have left for you. The earth holds us, Magnus. She held your sister Elise in her arms when we could not. She held you safe when the storm came. She is holding your father and me now. She will hold you too when your time comes, and she will hold your children and theirs. Build for them. Teach them. Pass it on. The earth is patient. She does not forget. Before I let you go, I want to ask you the question I asked at the beginning. When you imagined yourself in Hollow Creek in 1881, watching Henrik Vesterli dig his strange house into a hill, would you have laughed? Take a moment. Be honest with yourself. Tell me in the comments. Did you change your mind by the end? Or did you know somehow from the beginning that the strange ones are sometimes the ones who see what the rest of us have forgotten? I am asking because I think it matters. I think the world is full of Henriks and Ingrids and Annalises right now, today in your own town. People who know things the rest of us have forgotten. People who have inherited wisdom from grandparents we were too busy to listen to. People who are quietly preparing, quietly teaching, quietly building things that will outlast all of us. If you have a grandmother whose stories you have not heard in too long, call her. If you have an old neighbor whose hands know things your hands do not visit him. If you have a child or a grandchild who has been asking you the kind of questions that adults stop asking, answer them. Teach them. Pass it on. Because the storms always come. The Great White Burial of 1883 was not the first, and it was not the last. But the families who survived were the families who remembered. And the families who remembered were the families who had been taught. The earthen home of Henrik and Ingrid Vesterli is still standing today on the southern slope of Eagle Ridge in what used to be called Hollow Creek and is now part of a small county park in central Colorado. The interior temperature is still 54 degrees. The cedar door still opens outward just as Henrik designed it. The three south-facing windows still catch the morning light. The paste stove still works, though it has not been lit in over 30 years. And on the cedar door, carved by a hand that has been still for over a century, the words endure. The earth holds us. When we fight against the world often humbles us. When we work with the world can shelter us. This story has been told for almost 150 years in some form or another, in valleys across the American West, where earthen homes still stand and old families still remember the winter that taught them everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe. I find stories like this every week. Stories of ordinary people who carried extraordinary wisdom across oceans and generations and used it to save lives when the world was at its hardest. And let me know in the comments. What lesson from the past do you think the world most needs to remember right now? I read every comment. I am listening. Until next time, may the earth hold you, and may you pass on what you know before the storm comes.